Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Associate Professor Richard White, who is an RAHS counsellor and a committee member of the RAHS Events Committee. And he will be introducing our speaker and topic for today. Over to you, Richard.
Well, thanks, Philip. And I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the original inhabitants of the many lands from which we're coming from today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. And I must say, I'm really looking forward to this talk on garden design using Australian plants, a history, having just come in from digging in the garden. It was my very great pleasure to be able to introduce Stuart Read, who is a polymath, historian, horticulturalist, heritage officer, tour leader, urban planner, especially interested in the history of landscape and gardens in Australia. I'll just pass over to you, Stuart, and take it away.
Great. Thanks, Philip and Richard. Can I acknowledge I'm on Aboriginal land too? I'm in Caddy country, or grass tree people country, Gadigal land in Garajan in Elizabeth Bay. And even that, the name, what is the grass tree? It's the Caddy or the Gaddy, is relevant to today. So this is a bit of a skip through history, and let's get started. I think we underestimate just how exciting our plants were to the rest of the world. And we still underestimate that. I mean, the Wallamai pine is a recent example of excitement, Australian plants, but this has been going on for something like 300 years. You can probably read that faster than I can say it, but suffice to say that the name Joseph Banks ought to be known to people in Australia, or it's certainly in Sydney and certainly in New South Wales, even the name New South Wales, and a gentleman who might recommend a colony, or a prison colony at that, to a government, and a gentleman who might be remembered by a plant, and Banksia serrata is one such, and a gentleman who might have a florilegium, which is a collection of flora of a country or a garden, ought to be known to this audience, and ought to be known quite well. QBG is Kew Botanic Garden, now Royal Botanic Garden, who were growing our plants and selling them from the 1770s, before the first fleet arrived. Nurseries in London and exporting to the continent were selling our plants before the first fleet arrived. Josephine Bonaparte, I'm sure, is known to people in this audience. She ought to be known better than her husband. But anyway, she had a French Parisian garden full of Australian kangaroos hopping around, and plants that were under glass in winter but taken outdoors for the exoticism in summer. And get this, there was an all-native Australian botanic garden in Cheltenham and Gloucestershire in the 1830s. We had struggled to get one before 1988 in this country, which tells you something about how much we value our plants. But other people saw no problem with this and got into it quite early. This page is really just to make the point that attitudes weren't all the same about people who got off a ship or a fleet or got a piece of land and looked at Australia, looked at the vegetation, often as the enemy, often as something to be cleared and got out of the way, so that the real process of growing sheep or growing cows or, cutting timber could get underway. But even those that saw some value in the flora kept some, and some people quickly worked out that this was a different place from England with a different climate and a very different history, and that Aboriginal people had lessons to teach if anyone was willing to learn or to listen, not least what plants can kill you, what plants are useful, where does good fiber stuff go, because it takes a long time to get a boat with fresh supplies in a colony. There are other end of the world. So some people could see the beauty and the utility of plants early. And things such as design, or things such as showing off or doing different functions, came a bit later. Of course, in any colony, the early needs are practical. It's food, it's shelter, it's fiber, it's water, etc. The luxury stuff comes later, if you like. too many words on a page, but just what the hell is design and why does it matter? To make the point that there is a range of landscape or park or garden design, just as there is of any other entity like buildings. There's a range of eras from, I've mentioned 300 years ago till now. There's a range of reasons one might design, and I've already talked about this. Is it to do a job? Is it for a function? Or is it just for pleasure? There's a range of components of design, being built ones, which I'm sure we're all too familiar with, or being planted ones, more the focus of this talk. And plants have a huge range of types. But also that design might save us as a species. We're incredibly destructive and selfish as a species, and we depend on adapting our environment or our settlements, our systems to survive. And where our food comes from, where our fresh water, drinkable water comes from, where our fiber and our clothing and so on comes from, matter actually. And as well as that, there's matters of well-being and matters of identity and culture to be stoked, and plants are part of that, and so is nature. This looks a bit like a digestive tract. It's a style chart or a sort of fashion chart over time, 1790 at the top, 1970 at the bottom. The detail doesn't really matter, but it's just to make the point that you could pick a decade that you're interested in, like early Victorian, say 1840 to 50, and find there's 4 or 5 different design styles in fashion and in practice in that decade. So when you say, I've got an early Victorian house, I want an early Victorian garden, what does that mean? Is it garden-esque? Is it geometric? Is it square? Is it Arcadian? And what are those? Or I've got a 1920s California bungalow, I'd like a 1920s interwar garden thing. Fine, but what's going on in that decade? Quite a lot, actually. And you can't be so simple as saying, well, it's a 1920s garden, it must have X. Maybe. Styles are evolving, as you can see from the digestion. It goes off the page and it stopped 50 years ago. We could put a few more styles in today. And communications have got so complicated that we can know about any obscure type of design around the world in milliseconds, thanks to the internet. And so this is only getting more complicated, not less. But back to some practical examples. Here's a Norfolk Island pine-lined drive in Annandale, Sydney. Before there was a suburb, there was a farm called Annandale, belonged to a chap who was personally responsible for the Rum Rebellion, never mind the MacArthur component. There's the Johnson component, and this is the guy's front drive. Before he was back on the mainland of the colony, he was running the penal outpost, if you like, on Norfolk Island, as many soldiers did. And that tree was supposed to save the British Navy. They were, of course, as Europeans, gobsmacked at the 100-foot high, massive trunks, dead straight, nice and geometric, millable, might make perfect ship's masts for our Navy and our trading boats, etc. Not to be, it turned out to be crap timber for shipping, but it turned out to be fine timber for a drive. And that's quite early for an all-Australian formal use of a tree up an all-Australian garden, don't you think? Back in town, Governor Macquarie, a bit later, 1810s to 20s, was dressing up the dowdy government house and garden of his predecessors. And he had a wife, Elizabeth Macquarie, who was very well versed in laying out estates and had pattern books and quite a lot of ideas about taste and about landscape taste at that. So here's a bit of landscape taste. Notice the kangaroos on the lawn and the chap with the roller on the path. But also far right, notice the Norfolk Island pine showing off. And this is the front doorstep of Sydney. And, you come to, anyone of importance comes to town, goes to meet the governor. They march up this drive to the front door. Notice the grass trees, the caddy in the front garden. Not bad. And this is before, well, it's after Josephine Bonaparte's effort, but you can imagine this in Paris 20 years earlier. We were showing off our plants to educated people, by educated people, quite early. It's a bleachy photograph, but the same system going on. Macquarie's transformed old government house at Parramatta, tricked it up, turned it into a Palladian villa with side pavilions, whisked away all the military straight rows of onions and cabbages and things going to the front door under Philip and King and other governors. It was a very practical garden. This point about luxury coming later, the Macquaries had ideas about taste and good taste and educating the public, learn by doing. So in comes the curving line. And sure, there's exotic plants in this picture. There's oaks lining Riverside Drive. There's a willow within view. There's also 600 or 800-year-old forest red gums on that ridge, some of them with Aboriginal carvings in them. So there's an Aboriginal landscape that wasn't cut down. It wasn't cleared up and tidied and made into Europe. It was appreciated for what it was, the picturesque. So that's a layered landscape, which happens to be on the World Heritage List, which happens to include native plants. And you could call it a garden. It was a private garden for a long time before it became a public park. And the good burghers of Parramatta were allowed in the gates, but it's one of our oldest public parks and marvelous. Bit hard to see the text, doesn't really matter. Again, a chart that looks at street trees or trees used, for example, for shade in towns, or once we had councils for the first time from the 1850s, or once we had more councils, second time from the 1870s, what were they planting and where and why? And some of those are exotics, sure, there's oaks and there's pines on the right. Some of them are natives and right from the start. So 1786, you'll notice gums on the far right. You'll also notice Norfolk Island pines quite early. A bit later, I think it's 1830s, silky oak starts being used. Moreton Bay figs from the 1840s. Natives are a part of that mix from quite early on. And this is part, I'm only showing you one of 2 pages. It goes right up to date. But from the very beginning, we were using some native plants because we could see the value in them. I probably should devote this talk, or what's the word? Thank the lady in view here. This is Juliet Ramsey, one of my mentors, enjoying a moment of leisure at Penrith, at Mulgoa, at James Broadbent's front door. And notice you can't see his front door for the scrum of people, but also for the white cedar tree. Melia azedarac, a good Persian name for an Australian tree. We share this tree with India and with Persia, different names for the same tree, but a deciduous tree, quite rare. That's been put back. James, there's very good records of this property, including photographs, but also letters that there were white cedars at the front door. So white cedars have gone back in at the front door. 1810s house, that sort of era, a colonial, but an educated colonial, the Cox family, garden and farm, laid out using native trees as well as exotics. The chap who was running the country, could say the premier of the day, not the governor, but Alexander Macleay. I'm in Elizabeth Bay on part of his orangery, but once he went bust gardening at Elizabeth Bay, all of Elizabeth Bay was 54 acres of garden, thank you, Alexander. He went bust spending too much on that before he'd built his fabulous house, and washed up on the farm with George. George was the eldest son, running a number of sheep stations, including this one at Orangeville, Brownlow Hill. But look what's over that rather enticing roofline. Araucaria cunninghamii, the hoop pine or the Brisbane River pine. There's a forest of hoop pines and bunyas and other Australian native conifers and other trees, currajongs, other Australian trees in that garden, because Macleay could see the value in those trees and used them. A little grainy, but just to make the point that often in Sydney, at least, early farm homesteads and sites of significance are often marked by trees, and sometimes they're marked by araucarias, by native conifers, native pines, like the bunya. That's the big tree you can see there. As you can also see a Mediterranean cypress, or what some people call a pencil pine. So here comes the Mediterranean as well as Queensland, and things like fig trees. And the species used varies as you go around the country. It's partly to do with what's available and what will grow in my region or my district. But that tradition of marking, landmarks, you can't see the house. We can make out the house, but actually you can see the house's location from the trees from a long way away. And that's a signaling system. It's also a status, sort of a show off, a branding system. But what those trees were chosen to do that job is really interesting to look at. Here's that same species, the bunya pine, from the Bunya Mountains, Queensland's oldest national park. southeast Queensland, but also there's a colony of them north of inland from Cairns in the northeast. We were nuts about conifers in the Victorian era and through even before Victoria in the 19th century. And conifers were good money to go around the world. Tasmania had an export industry from quite early, from the 1810s, 20s, of Norfolk Island pines. Tasmania was repopulated with refugee soldiers and settlers from Norfolk Island to the Norfolk Plains in central northern Midlands, Tasmania, and down the east coast, Swansea way, who saw some money to be made out of selling Norfolk Island pines, not for ships' masts, but for conservatories to Europe. And they did. But also the bunya pine went around the world, much like the Wallamai pine has. And there's a woman in Queensland who's tracking the bunya diaspora. Here it is in California. Here it is outside a castle in Spain or a palazzo in Italy. That tree is, was a notable and a fashionable tree of its day. But the humble eucalypt even was favoured by some. Here's a farm outside Camden, outside Cobbitty, noted for the Cowper family and the Hook family called Denby. And what was the front drive is now a back drive, is lined with the local forest red gum. And on the left, I'm just also saying it's interesting fashions in street trees. I showed you that chart. Melbourne's famous for its elm tree lined streets now, and they're a replant. And before that's round two. Round one was blue gums, was, you might say, Tasmanian, you might say Victorian blue gums, marching down Melbourne streets. A very brave choice, but Ferdinand von Mueller, who was running the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne and was the state botanist, was nuts on blue gums and exported them around the world, actually. So that tree became a weed in some countries and a forestry staple in other countries, thanks to him. But it also was used in pride of place in one of our biggest cities. Gum trees remain popular as herbaceous perennials cut to the ground every year, much as we might a dahlia, for their coloured leaves. And the Northern Hemisphere has no problem with manipulating our plants to use them just for their beauty of the young growth, never mind that it might not grow into a tree. We're struggling with that still. I've mentioned some of these names already. Mueller. Charles Moore was running Sydney Botanic Gardens from 1848 to 1896. Joseph Maiden took over in 1896 to 1923. William Guilfoyle took over Melbourne Botanic Gardens 1873 from von Mueller, booted him out of the job actually. And all four of those blokes were in love with rainforest trees and figs and Australian conifers, such as the bunya pine, especially the fig, and used them in their landscape work, used them in those botanic gardens, and had enormous influence over public landscapes, courthouses, schools, etc., in their respective states for decades and decades. Here's a quote from William about the fig, because he'd done a lot of exploring in the volcano country, in the borderlands between New South Wales and Queensland. Fantastic monster, covered in orchids. And both, well, all four blokes actually were keen on conifers, but also keen on tropicalizing non-tropical Melbourne and non-tropical Sydney. And Melbourne, if you think about it, was a tent city full of sand and dust and dry kind of coastal scrubby environment. So is Sydney, actually. Sydney's a bit warmer and a bit further north. It's warm temperate. It's not tropical. So anything that can give that effect of lushness, of density, of shade, of cool shade in summer was absolutely favoured. And those respective trees do a great job still of shade and locality, reminding us we're not in Europe, we're not in America, we're in the South Pacific still. The other thing I should mention from craze land and manias is palm mania. And here's one of two palm groves in the Sydney Botanic Garden. This one's down the bottom in Farm Cove on the new garden, which Charles Moore doubled the size of the Botanic Garden, filled in the bay and made the lower garden. And this is a palm grove there. He also built an enormous collection of palms from the 1860s in Sydney, which is still globally significant for its diversity. And that's a global collection. Some of it's Australian. William Guilfoyle grew up 2 bays east of Sydney Cove, and Farm Cove, sorry, in Double Bay, and was a boy strolling these gardens and was nuts about palms and about that rainforest look. This is where he got the bug, if you like, that led him up a mountain in Queensland and then led him to sort of re-tropicalize von Mueller's rather ordinary Military Rose in Melbourne. Palms were huge business, and they still are huge business. We've got an export industry still in Lord Howe Island palms, or the parlour palm of choice, which you'll see in many a European hotel lounge room or a conservatory or a notable home, or even in modest suburban households like mine in New Zealand growing up. That was an exotic, a whiff of the subtropical South Pacific, wherever you live, that you could grow under glass. But you can do it in the outdoors here with our climate. As well as palms and conifers, we had a fern mania or pteridomania in the Victorian era, and ferns were stripped of nature and woodland forested Europe to fill up conservatories, to fill up terrariums, to fill up Wardian cases for great levels of profit. Thank you. Oh, you've got one with spots on the leaves and red ribs. How much is that, sir? Can you ship it to Chicago? So I'm cheating. This is a fernery in Auckland, but it could well be. I could show you Ripon Lee, a fantastic sort of banana-shaped steel fernery in the suburbs of Melbourne, or several large ones in Botanic Gardens. These were big and popular things. They also had an influence on the public, or I could build something a bit more modest in my backyard. And here's a delicious little book down the bottom telling you how to do it. Half Hours in the Australian Bush House. And a bush house usually means lattice. It's not glass, it's just timber lattice to cut the sun and make shade and make shelter, which is what these plants need, is understory conditions. There's no natives in this picture, but it's really just to remind you that public parks did not always exist, and we got them from about the 1850s, and not counting Hyde Park, 1810, that's an outlier and unusual. But from about the 1850s on, when we started getting councils, people started agitating for public open space. And often that was planted, courtesy of the state botanist of the day, the Charles Moore of the day, or in Melbourne, the Guilfoyle or the Von Mueller, sending plants out to your town, usually by railway, to a local railway station. And if you like, furnishing the furniture that you're looking at. And these are exotics, but some of those were natives. So a lot of country town parks, purported botanic gardens in regions, etc., and all the public institutions, police stations, hospitals, jails, etc., schools, were furnished with plants courtesy of the state nursery, of the state involved, and the gentleman I've mentioned. Here's an example at Richmond, on the edge of Sydney, what's now called Western Sydney University's Richmond campus. It used to be called Hawkesbury Agricultural College. It's got a glorious drive, about a mile long, with a triple avenue of trees along that mile. And some of those trees are native and rather unusual natives. It's a mixture of species. It may or may not have been influenced by William Guilfoyle from Melbourne, but originally from Sydney. He was mates with the headmaster at the time the college really got cranky. But it doesn't matter. It's just interesting what's in that avenue, what's in that set of grounds. It's a mixture, and some of them are very much Australian. How they survive out there with 40, 50 degrees summers is another challenge. This looks like, well, it's an up-to-date cemetery map, and the bullseye you're looking at is a railway station. So you deliver yourself and your coffin and your cortege, your party of family mourners, etc., by train from Sydney and via Lidcombe Station into a spur line. And there used to be 4 railway stations within this enormous area that's now called Rookwood, Rockopolis and Cemetery. This is stage 1 and stage 2 with the 3 main religions represented. Notice the curvaceous shapes, those serpentine lines of beauty. But part of the landscaping mix, thank you again, Charles Moore and people like that, James Jones, was native figs, was native conifers, things like bunyas and hoop pines that I've mentioned, was also retaining areas of woodland. Rookwood has wonderful natural areas with orchids and woodland and stuff that's been kept, and some of it grown back, because it's useful. It's shelter. It's leftover land that's not needed to be dug up for roads and railways and graves. Public landscaping. This is went up in a puff of smoke. This is our moment on the world stage, Australia's first international exhibition in Sydney. That building was so big it stretched more or less from the conservatorium to the State Library, straddled that piece of land just across the road from the Royal. All of Macquarie Street was a palace, if you like. Plus there was the palace grounds, which took over the domain and filled it up with other things like a temporary art gallery before we had an art gallery like a powerhouse sort of museum exhibit and so on and so forth. Our moment to sort of show off that we'd grown up and that we were a proper exporting country that was up to date and had industry and had mechanics and skilled artisans and skilled products that the world might be interested in, including landscapes. Charles Moore tricked up a very low budget, but got to be delivered yesterday kind of budget scheme landscape. And once we lost the building to fire and half of the exhibits, sad to say, we got to keep the setting. So what you go into the Botanic Gardens now, and the bit at the top facing Macquarie Street, if you like, and across the road from the State Library is intact. And they're still called the Palace Garden or the Palace Grounds because that's exactly what it was. Strolling grounds for Sydney to get its best clothes on, bring the kids, hop on our first tram and go to the show and show off, look at each other, gawk at products and have a jolly good day out. And we're still doing that even without an expo there. I've been rude about Mueller. These black lines are Ferdinand von Mueller doing rigid scientific botanic garden work in Melbourne. And the red lines are William Guilfoyle sexing up Melbourne for a more demanding public who are less interested in science and less interested in botany and much more interested in what I've just been rude about too, strolling on paths that are 18 foot wide so that I can fit mum and the pram and the husband and the girlfriends and so on in one group, not have to go single file. Curvaceous lines. So I'm just curious, what's just around that corner and where is the kiosk and how do we get to the cafe? He made it a lot more friendly to the public and a lot more beautiful to look at, as well as being a botanic garden and a good collection. You might say a clever bureaucrat, but what we love about Melbourne Botanic Garden today is pretty much thanks to that man. And it's partly to do with the fern gully and the fig trees and the natives that he put in. Here's another quote from William about the red flowering gum. When I was a kid in New Zealand, I had a tree fort up one of these. This is one of my introductions to Australian trees. It was a bit of a shock to see it in the wild. They're just tiny little hummocky shrubs in a wind-blown paddock in Warnpole, Nornalup, southwestern WA in the wild. Nothing flash. You wouldn't know it turned into a tree. That had two crazes, one in the mid-Federation period, thanks to Guilfoyle, and another one between the two wars. It's having another bit of a craze now because you can get hybrids on the market now that are even smaller, even brighter, and a bigger range of colors. Good for pots, good for patios and small gardens. Fantastic tree. Really should say thank you to artists for this talk and for our consciousness, because they're often the first to see beauty and to celebrate beauty and to show us, to remind us. This is Alice Rowan, but she had plenty of competitors and people came after, waves, but Sydney heath, the pink flowering heath, the waratah, etc. Flannel flowers, it's coming to love these things and see beauty all around us, often is thanks to artists actually. Rainy photo, but just to suggest that the leafy North Shore was actually once leafless and was very dusty. So it was grumpy housewives with fresh, clean white washing and scrubbed bloomers on the line, getting non-sealed roads, right? So any gust of wind and there's dirt on my washing, not happy, Jan. So the only reason we got street trees was agitation of people like Annie Wyatt that set up the National Trust and her neighbours that led to the leafy North Shore streets that we all love today, and that owners today are suing each other over, house extensions and driveway upgrades, and those trees are a problem to manage, of course, but they're also the reason we think it's attractive to buy there in the first place. So perhaps we're just a little forgetful about what matters. The Federation era, we squabbled for a good 20 or 30 years about becoming a country. So the Federation period is that squabble period. And it's, yes, we federated in 1901, but that was 20 years after several conferences around the country, much like now with the Voice referendum, much bickering about where should be the capital and what were the arrangements and what would a federal government look like and so on. And then probably you could say up into the 1920s would be the Federation period as well, because it played out. We had one, and what did that mean? During that period, lots happened in Australia. We got railway systems, we got suburban sprawl, we got reticulated water, very significant for gardens, and we got the suburban dream. You didn't have to live in a Surrey Hills and walk to the factory or walk into town. You could live at a railway suburb of your choice further out that you might be able to afford more land, you might be able to have a garden. etc. What did that mean? And what was that dream? So here's that dream in Mount Gambier, but it could be in a number of Sydney suburbs for that matter, a California bungalow on land, on wouldn't say acreage, but half an acre, standard roses lining the drive, etc. A nice green shade of lawn. And here's one of the Bibles, Gardening in Australia. Thank you, Mr. Pescott. There were other Bibles, Yates Garden Guide and Bunnings Australia. But, you know, notice the dream. And if only I could achieve something that looked like the dream. My delphiniums are no good this year, but, you know, this was the dream that everyone could afford and had on the back porch. Queensland was at it too. And notice the tree fern shading this rather attractive Queensland house. There's that idea about ferns, and native ferns at that, being part of the mix of those gardens. It's a bit hard to make this out. This is Walter Butler was a society architect and quite influential in Melbourne. A job he had for a client in Toorak that was very keen on native plants included this. And notice the words, the Australian garden and the gully. And notice the curvaceous lines and the rigid geometry near Butler's exciting house, which I'm not showing you, but the informality and the nativeness of an Australian garden in 1907. Thank you, Melbourne. Thanks to the client, I suggest. I wouldn't give Butler the credit for that, although he drew it and, you know, it happened. But that's probably more to do with the client than the designer. Very scratchy photo, but I love this. A flat-roofed house in 1919, just after the war in Melbourne. Harold Desborough Anir was an architect and an adventurous one, and a front yard full of blue gums. I mean, imagine doing this anywhere in Australia today. It would be, you know, flat roofs were prohibited for decades. Harry Sadler had several famous court cases with North Shore councils to try and get a flat roof house built in the 20th century in Sydney. Here's one in Melbourne with an all-native front garden in 1919. Bit hard to see, looks a bit like a digestive tract again. This is street trees and brush box, Queensland brush box tree lining a street called the Appian Way, a nice Roman classical name for an upper Burwood Street, at the end of the water pipe in Burwood. And I mentioned reticulated water. We had to use buckets and feet to water things before about the 1880s, 90s, but then we got municipal and state water schemes and water pipes, and chopping up the pipe at the end of the pipe delivery system. I'm not showing the mansion of the developer over the road was this, and a middle-class garden suburb for managers and people of taste to live on a street that had trees on it, to live on a street that had a shared tennis court / bowling green in the middle of it. And it's $1 million to fart on that street now. It's quite good investment, actually. Here's the same system going on with a chap who I'm, Charles Read, was a planner in South Australia, but here he is doing Colonel Light garden suburb. Same idea, you know, it's a suburb that in a garden, so that public space is lined by trees and nature strips. That wasn't standard in all suburbs, and everyone had a garden and you're expected to look after it. Unfortunately, 1 in 5, I think, Australians lost their lives in World War I. That was a big shock and a big wake-up call to urban and rural Australia. Boys who didn't come home, girls who were nurses and didn't come home. So we started commemorating them, and some of that was done with trees and with avenues. And it's interesting to look at avenues across Australia and peace groves and other plantings, single trees, lone pines from Gallipoli. Often they were using natives. Sometimes they were using exotics. Here's a native, a Queensland tree marching up a Kings Park, Perth drive. It wasn't initially put in as a war memorial. It was renamed later in the 60s. Pardon me, but it has a plaque to a soldier or a platoon at the bottom of every tree. Same tree marching up a private drive. This is Rupert Murdoch's mother's place, Elizabeth Murdoch, Cruden Farm in the burbs of Melbourne now, but was in the country outside Melbourne. And you could argue about whose great idea it was to use lemon-scented gum up a drive, a private drive. Could have been exotics, could have been formal. It's certainly not. It's natives, it's informal, and it's absolutely brilliant. Whose ever idea it was. It might have been Edna Walling, the garden designer's idea. Elizabeth actually gives Russell Grimwade credit for the idea. And you'll also notice the different sizes of the trunks. There was a grass fire in the 40s, so even though the avenue was planted early in the 20s, it was replanted in part after the fire. So that's why there's younger tree. absolutely glorious on a hot summer day to walk up that drive and smell the lemon smell of those gums and see the colours. Not really doing the colours credit, but pinks, oranges, greys, creams, whites. Again, another plug for artists. You would know Margaret Preston's work. You might know Nora Heysen's work, Hans's daughter, famous for, you could say, still lives and floral portraits, and celebrating, the rough and the rugged looking Banksias, the sort of modernist flowers, if you like. Thistle Harris, a writer and an environmentalist, writing books and giving talks and articles, encouraging people to plant more natives. Here she is celebrating. I've got a book. I suppose you won't be able to see it, but the 1950s, no, it doesn't come across. 1953 book of hers about gardening with native plants. Long career, talking that up, I suppose. I grew up with Snugglepot and Cuddlepie books, and perhaps you did too. Terrified of the big bad Banksia man. Banksia serrata, his Banksia integrifolia, the coastal Banksia, at the bottom of May Gibbs's garden at Nutcote in Neutral Bay. If you haven't been, go and have a look. It's even got a little plaque under it with a date, sort of 1850s. So the tree predates the house. But I love that an artist would sit in her house, look out her window into a Banksia tree, and might write about it. Oh, there's a kookaburra. I'll put that in my story. And generations of Australian kids absorbed some knowledge of bush and gum blossoms and gum blossom babies, etc., through those books. Thank you, May. Leslie Wilkinson was an Englishman appointed as the first professor of architecture at Sydney University when we set up a faculty. He was in love with the Mediterranean as well as Georgian architecture and Georgian revival, you might say. And this is his own house called Greenway, after Francis Greenway, architect, but from the 1920s in Vaucluse. And look at the front lawn. To get to the front door, you come in a gate behind to the left, the front left, sorry, and tiptoe through this grove of Angophora costata, the Sydney red gum or coastal smooth barked Angophora. Beautiful, wobbly, wonky trees to get to the front. He thought they mattered enough to keep those trees and to fight, the tradespersons of the day, no doubt. And, I'm laying my path and it's ruining my paving. Glorious. And every visitor coming to see him saw those trees. And you're in Sydney to see that tree. You're on sandstone to see that tree. Very prescient. Western Australian University is now predominantly native. Didn't start that way, but thanks to this guy, Oliver Dowell, and thanks to the period just between and at the end of the Second World War, tricked it up seriously with natives and made it a lot more user-friendly. So here's an amphitheatre and a sunken garden in the middle of that campus that's all native and absolutely enticing on a hot summer day. Shady place to go. Even in cold climates, I've mentioned the white cedar at Broadbent's door. Here's the white cedar marching down a rather too wide Bathurst street. And a deciduous tree is pretty important in winter, stiff climate places like Bathurst inland. But you can still use native trees there. You just pick the right one, and we should do a lot more of that. Before we had television and the internet and multiple distractions, we had the theatre and then the movies. And the movies were black and white and silent at the beginning, and then we got colour, and then we got sound. Bit exciting, but going to the movies in Parramatta. This has been a conservation campaign, the Roxy lately, but here it is in happier times. As part of a state government tourism, you'll love every bit of Sydney kind of promotion. But look at the palms you're walking under, to swaying palm leaves to go and see your Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford movie in the 20s or the 30s. Fabulous, so you come out of your fantasy land inside and you're in another fantasy land outside, because we're not in Sydney, we're in Lord Howe Island or in the South Pacific. The trees, which are Australian, are part of the picture and part of the illusion. Government architects sometimes favoured native trees in their work, not just the guy running the Botanic Gardens, but when we did a lot of psychiatric hospitals and mental asylums and things like that, this tree marched around the state for a decade or so, and I wish it was marching around the state with a lot more vim and vigour now. It needs more fans. The cypress pine, you could say, oh, it's just like a Mediterranean cypress, what's your problem? Well, it's local and it's better adapted, actually, and there's a range of species and colours. Why don't we use this way more? Yeah, a little bit more, perhaps too much, about designers. These are the couple, the Chicago couple, she an architect, he architect become landscape architect, who designed Canberra and, lucky for us, came to Australia. And they also designed suburbs. Here they are outside a little house named for a mushroom, a one-room house that they lived in Eaglemont in Melbourne. Gardening, I love that. And they also did an all-native plan for the Catholic College, Newman College of Melbourne University, which was way before its time, 1917, and really should be put in. It's probably hard to read, but this is Eric Nichols ran the Sydney office for the Griffins while they were running the Melbourne one, or going to and from Canberra as well. And here's a plan from that office, 1931, and it's half natives. And even drilling down a bit, it's some quite unusual rare natives. And you think, well, where did they get their plants from in 1931? To get some of those plants are quite hard to get now, but pretty racy. And obviously the client was supportive. There's only one book on the period between the wars in terms of gardens. And I can commend this book. It's out of print and hard to get, but persist by all means if you're interested. And it's multiple authors. I'm one, but Colleen Morris and a few others you'll know are in there. But what was the designs fashionable between the wars? What kind of hard structures, pergolas and arbors and things, and what sort of plants, and how do I put back that garden if I've lost it, and so on. I mentioned Edna Walling. She was a Brit who via New Zealand settled in Australia. Long design career, mostly Victoria, some in New South Wales, some in Queensland. She fell in love with Australian roadsides and gums. Here she is. Yes, there's daffodils in this picture. There's also lovely old gums. There's a whole book celebrating the Australian road, going for a drive in the country and a picnic by the side of the road. She could see the beauty. So gums started either coming into or being fought to being kept in plans she was doing. Here she is just before the war, working for the polo playing Ashton Brothers, south of Orange, keeping the local yellow box trees and building new stuff around them. That wall is very Edna, and there's other exotics, of course, but natives as part of place and part of structure. I'm very keen on this guy. He looks like he's got a telegraph pole growing out of his head. Max Shelley had a design career in Sydney and then in Adelaide over several decades, wrote for magazines. And in Sydney is perhaps best known for Boomerang, which is just over the street from where I live. Here it is in Australian Home Beautiful, in The Home, the magazine of quality, on the left in 1926 with bananas, but also in 1990, thank you, Stuart, with the Norfolk Island pine. Interesting. Jocelyn Brown, same sort of thing. She was an industrial designer, graphic designer, but also a garden designer. A long career, 50 years, 2 states, New South Wales, Queensland. Popularized her trade and got work through magazines and published plans and opened her garden through magazines. Here she is working in the country, not in Sydney, and notices a silky oak at the forecourt of the front door of a country house outside Scone. Pretty racy and pretty interesting choice of tree for the front door, not being coy, not tucking it down the back out of the way and all the mess that silky oaks make, right at the front door. This guy's probably well known, Paul Sorensen. Again, a long career, mostly in New South Wales. Best known for this place, Everglades, Blue Mountains. Notice the tree. It's a scribbly gum. It's a local gum. It's being kept. Notice the change of level around the tree, the kind of retaining planter box, if you like. That would have been a fight with the client to keep it. It was kept. So you'd have your game of squash and emerge all hot and sweaty and strip and jump in your plunge pool and then do eurythmics on the lawn under an Australian tree, because you're not in Switzerland anymore. You're not in France or Denmark or places Sorensen had worked for bankers doing exactly the same sort of modernist garden. You're in Australia, actually. Here he is doing a garden in Exeter in the Southern Highlands for the Hoskins family of Australian iron and steel, latterly BHP fame. And yes, it's got a cherry dell down a gully, but it's also got a fern dell. And guess where the ferns come from? Part of his mixture, his palette, is native. These 2 girls, Betty Maloney and her sister, Jean Walker, were country Victoria girls who married Sydney blokes and moved up here. And jolly good thing they did. They were keen on natives and fell in love with sandstone flora. And this is Betty's tiny French's Forest studio and garden outside her studio. She was a painter and an artist, and she looked at this and she created this from a bare block. And this is Jean, the sister's garden plan. Sorry, it's a bit scratchy and hard to read, but it's full of natives. Funny that. And it was Jean's beautiful artwork that really, they did little wee books called the Australian Bush Garden. And, you know, how you can create a bush garden, and created a craze, really. $5 books, so really affordable. And these beautiful drawings to make it attractive to do it. Another drawing, Bruce Mackenzie, a designer with a long career in Sydney mostly, and public landscapes mostly, tricking up a completely artificial new park in post-industrial land on the port of Sydney, Banks Meadow, an ironic name for a suburb that's mostly full of shipping containers and docks now, but doing reclaimed land and post-industrial parks by pencil sketch. I mean, I did sketches like this at university. It looks amazingly naive now to look at it, but welcome to the 1970s. And also the 70s, perhaps our best Australian garden is the one at the Sculpture Garden around the National Gallery, Canberra. I hope you've been. Sydney designers, Barbara Buchanan and Harry Howard. It's been adjusted, underplanted later with lower growing plants, which is a good thing. It's getting a bit of curation. And yes, it's a stage for sculpture, but it's a beautiful Australian garden full of only native plants. And if it's your only visit to Australian garden as a tourist to the country, it's a pretty good introduction. Even radical behaviour on suburbs, it continues to happen. In the 70s, here's an Englishman and an Australian artist shacking up in Gardner Street, Downer, suburban Canberra, and putting nature back onto the nature strip. There's no lawn on their nature strip, there's bush. They've created that using newspaper mulch, and slowly that virus has infected the neighbours and gone down the street. So there actually is nature on the nature strip of Gardner Street, thanks to a couple of artists who can see the merit. Even old colonial, well, not settler farms that were mostly exotic, with things like pines for shelter, have been rejigged over time as attitudes change, as generations swing. And here we are, you know, almost in Victoria, Snowy Mountains Farm, putting gums up the drive, and casuarinas near the house. Interesting, in the 1960s and 70s. Bruce Mackenzie in action on the left, Peacock Point or Illura Reserve in Balmain, and on the right, McGregor Coxall doing a more postmodern version of the same process, taking a park where there had been oil tanks, Ballast Point in Balmain, Birch Grove, Balmain, turning it into a fantastic and all native post-industrial park. So anyone going there now might think it's natural, and that's a sign of success. It's design you can't see, because the design is trying to emulate nature, or stylizing nature, so that, you know, if you don't have a garden and you never get to the bush, but you get here, you get some sense of what the bush is all about. And we've been tricking up and rejigging parks too. The Bicentenary was a good opportunity for that. And here's a park even named for the Bicentenary in Glebe, and subject to young and older planting. The big figs on the left would be 1870s, 80s, 90s. The young figs on the right would be 1988-ish. And some of them didn't work, but that process of renewal and choice, what do we put in? Do we go native again? Do we repeat the species? Do we mix it up a bit? Is germane. This is a drive in Tasmania, a husband and wife. He's an antique dealer and English. She's Australian and an artist. They have a drive each. It's a wonder the marriage works. His drive is full of English trees, poplars and elms and so on, because he's English. Her drive is Australian, and it's full of Eucalyptus amygdalina and Banksia marginata, the silver local Banksia. Absolutely glorious. You can guess which drive I prefer, but I think it's rather nice that you can do a drive in any species you like, thanks, and you know, it's your choice. Another English woman, Jean Villani, her place at Bayview, Waterfall Cottage. Doesn't rain much, but when it does rain, there's a thundering waterfall the other side of the house. She was a nurseryman's daughter from Hastings in England, but she could see the beauty of the rainforest and this gully she's in at Bayview, and of bird's nest ferns growing straight out of rock. You know, tough gardening, but beautiful garden. She also generously opened that garden to the public once a year for, you know, something like 25 years. So that garden was quite influential on others, thanks to that vision. This is my favorite newspaper title, ankle biters bring council to their knees. This smiling woman is the assassin who was the mayor of Waverley at the time, who wanted to cut down these paperbark trees because they're dangerous and they could drop and kill a child. And this is a childcare centre. And, you know, I've got a parent that's complaining. And these kids are not having a bar of that. They love their paperbacks. And watch out, world, when these kids grow up and expect to be voting and paying rates and, you know, having a say about things like, I think that's quite encouraging, really. So, of course, guess who won? The paperbacks did. And here's the mayor smiling about it. And back in the Northern Beaches, here's Mona Vale Woolworth car park, margin landscape. And here's that lovely, same Sydney red gum or Angophora I showed you on the front lawn at Vaucluse, but being a jolly nuisance for a supermarket trolley or a pram or anyone going down the footpath. And you can just imagine how grumpy the council engineer was about this. He lost the argument, but I'm happy to say the trees won it for a change. We're capable of this. It's sad to say that other countries still appreciate our plants more than we do. Here's a street of banks in Barcelona that's lined by currajongs, trained very formally, straight up. I'd love to see a street of banks in Australia lined, you know, meeting currajongs at the front door. And here's a park in an ex-sewing machine factory, bit of industrial Barcelona, fairly grungy suburb, with river red gums providing shade to your Miro sculpture. The Spanish have no problem with our plants, and we could take a leaf out of their book. Here we are doing slightly better. This is Mirvac, laying out new suburbs on what was Little Bay, or the Coast Hospital at Little Bay. But notice the tuckaroo trees, notice the tiny, but there are nature strips and the local tree and the local banks here over the road. So clever choices, because it's salt-laden winds, it's quite exposed, but there will be shade on that street. And there is some suggestion that we're on the coast of the east coast of Australia in the choices they're making. Even the ground can be an area of experimentation. Here we are at Melbourne Botanic Gardens' annex in an old sand quarry at Cranbourne, the Australian Garden. And on the right, people like me with no land and no earth can take inspiration from these rather delicious designer racks with Australian orchids hanging on them. I could do that, you know, to stick them on the wall is one thing with a nail, but you could have rather dressy racks for that matter. Good ideas for places with no space, and good ideas about mulch and what's on the ground underneath your plant, because you're stuck looking at that all year too. So why not play around with materials and colors to good effect? One of my favorite words is xeric, which basically means dry or without water. And here's a woman, a designer, Fiona Brockhoff, in Victoria, on a sand dune, growing plants that like sand dunes and like gale force winds on occasion in Melbourne's Port Phillip Bay, clipping the local casuarinas into lollipops, growing exotics and coastal natives. But what will grow in my place? And where am I anyway? Good questions. Marion Blackwell, same thing, a WA designer, landscape architect, long career, a lot of mining communities and revegetation work. Here she is making her 4th or 5th garden in her late 80s in suburban Perth, all suburban sand plain Perth flora. No lawn, no clipped hedges. I'm sure the neighbours are quite angry, but good on her. You know, she's way ahead of her neighbours in terms of where am I? I'm on sand. I'm in Perth. What grows here naturally? Inspiration galore. I've mentioned smaller things. We have smaller gardens. We need smaller plants. I haven't got room for a blue gum tree. I have got room for a small mallee. I haven't got room for a big waratah. I have got room for a small one. There's work to be done in selection and in promotion and in education, but there are plants to suit every purpose. On top of a pretty ordinary block of millionaires' flats in Woolloomooloo is a roof garden, and roof gardens are nothing new, but they're having a vogue. Here's a not so exciting one, but at least there is one, softening the radiation level off that roof while you shortcut across the bay to the Botanic Gardens or the Art Gallery. Lovely. That's probably enough from me. My night job is this mob. There's a rumor that they're a secret society that no one can join. It's absolutely untrue. Here's a website, go for your life. And I've stolen pictures and inspiration of all of these people. So I should say a big thank you to them, because there's plenty more out there if you're into this subject. It's just a matter of digging a bit, really. But yeah, I hope that was of interest. And maybe you've got a question or two.
Thanks, Stuart. That was a brilliant talk. We've got about 5 minutes for questions, if anybody has any. And we already have one. So I think we will start the questions. But look, I'll just say to everybody, if you want to show your appreciation, put something in the chat. Use the emojis that we've got available. Just let Stuart know how much you enjoyed this talk, because it was very good. Thank you. Okay, so we have a question on how common were, okay, this Richard says, I've been noticing how common paperbarks are in the street trees. When did they take off? And when you say early arrivals valued the native plants, sorry, what was it about them they valued? Was it the shade, the aesthetic, the timber?
Yeah, okay. Look, paperbacks, I might be wrong, but I would suggest 1960s, 70s plus. You'll find them on streets and councils, post-war councils. It's interesting to look at aerial photographs just of Sydney, wartime Sydney, through to the now, and absolutely bare streets in some suburbs, and then vegetated streets come 1970s, 80s, 90s. And some of that is paperbarks. It might be earlier waves, but that's the one I'm aware of. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the second question.
I'll read it out again. All good.
Yep.
When you say that the early arrivals, the early European British arrivals,
yep,
they valued native plants, what was it about them that they valued? Was it the shade, the aesthetic, or just the timber?
Yeah, look, good question. And easy answer is all of the above. Depends on who. For instance, there's a bit of a collection of women, you could say isolated women on country properties. And I can give you one example, is Georgiana Malloy in Augusta, southwestern Australia, who's stuck on a farm, pregnant or, jostling babies, and has a brain, right? And has education and has eyes. She was also an artist, but she was exchanging plants with Captain Mangles in England and the Drummonds in Perth from early on. And that's a pattern right around the country. Von Mueller had spies, most of them women, and most of them, women lacking agency. So I'm not saying it was only women, but certainly early people could be artists, could be educated people, certainly were interested, like, where am I? And, oh gosh, this is so different to my last posting in India or in the West Indies. Why is it different? They would be asking those questions anyway. Other needs were very practical. I need wind shelter, so I'll keep that belt of eucalypts. That's handy. My lambing sheep are going to go there in winter. So it was all of the above. Well, we needed timber, we needed fiber. So actually, some of it's very practical, but some of it was education or awareness.
Thank you. Just going through the comments. So Marianne says, thank you, great talk. And she's just she was too traumatized by the Banksia men and has only learned to just get over that.
Me too.
Helen Oates says, great presentation from a fellow AGHS, Australian Garden Historical Society member. And we have a question from Pamela, who wants to know not something about gardens, but she wants to know, how is it that Australian natives were available in Europe before the first fleet arrived? Were they collected by Cook or the French explorers?
Both. And I mean, Cook was here in 1770 and Banks was on board, and so was Daniel Solander or Solander. So the British were doing it. The French were certainly doing it. Remember how Matthew Flinders circumnavigated Australia and bumped into the French in Encounter Bay, South Australia? Well, those French, that was one of two. Bougainville, La Perouse both had scientific expeditions snooping around for science. Purportedly, there's rumours that they were, perhaps going to settle too, and that triggered the British to settle. The Portuguese and the Spanish get short truck from English-speaking historians, but the Portuguese and the Spanish were, of course, charting our coasts and trying to avoid shipwrecks on Western Australia. William Dampier bumped into Western Australia in the 1600s. So, there's been, not to mention Indonesian sea slug traders and other people coming and going who may have been coming and going with plants and plant products as well. So again, it goes back centuries. Even the Chinese, the links are probably centuries old, not just the gold rush plus. That's a rich subject for more research, for more inquiry, really. Who were these people and when? And why don't we speak Spanish and look at their records, etc.?
So we did receive a question earlier before the talk And someone wants to know, look, if they wanted to recreate a native garden in their own home, what sort of records are there that's available to them?
Okay, look, your best friend is probably the librarian at the Royal, Donna. And if you have one, a local studies librarian too, I'm sure you'll know that for your area, but have a look at your council website and your council library system and make some inquiries. You know, what have they got? Has anyone done a local history? Has anyone published one? Has the council perhaps done a report, done a what we call a heritage study? You know, say I lived in Killara, you know, the Ku-ring-gai is the council. And of course, there's a Ku-ring-gai heritage study. Sometimes those studies are online. Sometimes you have to go to the library to read it, fair enough. But what exists? Have a look at writings, and Trove is your best friend here, trove.nla.gov.au, and pop it in, you know, gardens plus Victorian, or, you know, find your era, Edwardian or interwar, or, you know, or gardens plus Sydney or gardens plus Killara or whatever, and see, particularly newspapers or particularly magazines of the time can be your best friend. I mean, I found a run of garden magazines in the Mitchell Library. Fantastic. Thank you very much. You know, The Home and Australian Home Beautiful and Garden Gossip, and they're just a mine of information. Even the advertising in magazines of the day, oh, rubber hoses, or, you know, here's an exciting lattice work arch I can build for my exciting, you know, California bungalow for 1922. That's in the magazines of the day because they're trying to sell you the products of the day. So, but ask around, and yeah, be patient, because there will be, it might take you time to find stuff, but general stuff exists. The more specific stuff takes a bit of scratching.
Well, look, we're out of time, and but it's been a fantastic talk. And unfortunately, Richard had to duck out a little earlier. But he just wanted me to say, on behalf of the Royal, thank you for presenting today, Stuart. It's been a brilliant talk. I've enjoyed it, and I can tell our audience has loved it too.
My pleasure. Sorry about the bumpy start, but we got there, yeah?